Justin's going to bring our final session, which is the surprising rebirth of belief in God. And I'm going to hand over to Justin now. Thank you, Justin.
My technical assistant is just sorting out the computer. Well, thank you so much. It's been such a pleasure to spend the day with you all here. And what's fun for me is that I'm about to give a talk that I've never given before. This is completely new because the book is completely new. In fact, it hasn't even been released yet. The surprising rebirth of belief in God. But as Andy mentioned, it is one of the 3 books that's available if you choose to support Solas. But equally, if you leave your email, they will be sending out, I understand, an email to let you know where you can get hold of it. You can pre-order it and so on. It's available actually for pre-order from my own website, justinbrierley.com. Now, I won't be simply selling you a book, as has happened across the course of the day in this lecture. What I want to talk to you about is what's behind this book. Now, perhaps like me, you have to deal with email overload in today's day and age. Most of them you can ignore, most of them you can delete. But do you ever get something in your inbox that makes you stop in your tracks? One of the most surprising emails I ever received was back in 2018. And it was from a man called Peter Boghossian. I haven't got my clicker around. Oh, here it is. I've got it here. Peter Boghossian. Now, I had emailed Peter about taking part in a live debate, on-stage debate in the USA back in 2018. And this was because Boghossian was an atheist professor of philosophy at Portland State University. And he'd joined me 4 years previously as a guest on my Unbelievable show for quite a hard-hitting debate on God. In fact, he had recently written a book called A Manual for Creating Atheists. It was almost exactly what it says. It was a set of strategies for arguing people out of their faith. So when he responded to this email, some 4 years later in 2018, I was shocked because the person emailing me seemed to be a completely different person. He told me he was no longer participating in debates against Christians. Indeed, he felt quite differently about people of faith than he once did. He said, "You might be surprised at how much I have in common with you now." He said he was now focused on a different enemy, one which he thought was a far more pernicious threat to him and his free-thinking friends than Christians ever were. And he said, "You'll find out more soon." So what had led to this dramatic change in tone from Peter Boghossian? Well, a few months later, I did find out, because Boghossian, along with 2 of his academic colleagues, were at the centre of an academic ruse, submitting hoax academic papers to peer-reviewed journals. And it was in order to expose so-called grievance studies. These are critical theories in academia that have become very popular, placing things like sexism and patriarchy and gender and identity and a range of other grievances at the centre of every subject. And by simply using the right terminology, Boghossian and his friends were able to pass off all kinds of outlandish theories about dogs engaging in rape culture and dressing up sections of Mein Kampf by Hitler as genuine academic arguments. So this hoax was eventually rumbled and the episode sparked a lot of debate. And Boghossian and his colleagues, what they claimed was that their spoof papers showed how certain orthodoxies and ideologies were taking over university campuses and squashing dissent by cancelling those who disagreed with them. Now, whatever you think of those issues, the hoax and what they were up to, what really struck me was that Boghossian now saw Christians more as his allies than as his enemies. He was still an atheist, of course, but his tone had changed dramatically. Christians were no longer the enemy. It was now, for him at least, the progressive left. Now, Peter Boghossian's story is one among many I could point to where I've seen a bit of a sea change in recent years about the way conversations between Christianity and atheism have changed. Now, we all know the statistics about church decline in the West, don't we? We heard some of it earlier from Andy right at the beginning of the day. 25% of people now in the UK say they don't claim any religion whatsoever. And that same survey last year showed that under half of people for the first time in the UK put Christian on the box when they answer what religion they are. Many young people now grow up with no experience of church. Most millennials and Gen Z or Gen Z, if you're using the Americanism, describe themselves as nuns. They don't claim any religious affiliation. And all of this might seem a bit depressing, you know. Will the Christian church simply die out, as has been predicted many times in the past? Is an increasingly secular and materialistic culture all of our futures? Has atheism won, essentially? Well, I would argue no. Yes, we're certainly living through a very post-Christian era in the West, but Christianity has always experienced many deaths and rebirths. I love this quote by G.K. Chesterton, which says, "Christendom has had a series of revolutions, and in each of them Christianity has died. Christianity has died many times and risen again, for it had a God who knew the way out of the grave." In fact, I think, despite the statistics we often are presented with, that our culture may be at the very beginning of a phenomenon that I've decided to call the surprising rebirth of belief in God. It's the title of this forthcoming book, and it has this picture of a tide coming in on the front cover. Why that particular image? Well, it's because a few years ago I hosted a conversation with someone called Douglas Murray. He's a well-known agnostic journalist. He's the deputy editor of The Spectator here in the UK. And he was speaking in this interview about the fact that he had noticed some of his friends, thinking, sensible people, converting to Christianity. And he was wondering, well, what's behind that? And in the course of that interview, he referenced a quite well-known poem by the Victorian poet Matthew Arnold called Dover Beach. And it contains this famous line about the melancholy, long withdrawing roar of the sea of faith. In Arnold's time, he saw faith receding. And how much more have we seen that in the following 150 years? The sea of faith going out. But, said Murray in our conversation, the interesting thing about the sea of faith is there's no reason why it can't come back in again. That's the point of tides, right? And it made me wonder, what if we are beginning to see the sea of faith reaching its furthest limit before it begins to come back in again? One of the things that made me wonder whether that could be true was the way I had seen the nature of the conversations changing in recent years. Now, as I said earlier, the new atheism was really how the show began. It was those kind of full-on combative debates between die-hard atheists and Christian thinkers. And it was spearheaded by these four gentlemen. You can see on the screen there, from left to right, Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens and Daniel Dennett. These were the figureheads, if you like, of this movement, selling best-selling books, sort of declaiming faith. And the movement gathered a lot of steam in the mid-2000s. It was a sprawling online community. There were atheist conferences and rallies. You might remember here in the UK, the atheist bus campaign that said there's probably no God, now stop worrying and enjoy your life. It was, it's basically an advertising campaign for atheism. And the conversations, as I say, that we hosted in those years were primarily these combative debates that matched the boisterous and dismissive attitude of these new atheist thinkers. But as the years progressed, the conversations changed. Increasingly, the atheists and agnostics who came on my show were increasingly keen to distinguish themselves from the movement. Often an atheist would say, well, I'm not a Richard Dawkins type of atheist. And the tone of the debate changed too. Instead of these bombastic debates, I was increasingly featuring people who shared more common ground on cultural and social issues, even if they didn't share the same faith. And I think in the public, a lot of people kind of got a bit tired of what turned out to be a kind of shrill dogmatism of the new atheism itself. It had even started to look a bit religious, with its own high priests and sacred texts and dogmas about the nature of reality that could not be questioned. They had their own heretics as well, when people said things that fell outside of that materialistic understanding of the universe. And then within the movement, it began to experience a sort of internal meltdown. I won't give you the full history here, but a series of events led to many of the chief architects of this movement falling out with each other about the direction the new atheist movement should be going in. Some were unhappy that it was this phalanx of old white men who were leading it effectively. They said there's too much sexism, patriarchy, privilege in this movement. And there was a splinter movement for a while called Atheism Plus, where you also had to embrace, LGBT rights, feminism, social justice issues alongside your atheism. But others reacted very strongly against that. They saw it just as political correctness. All we need is science and reason in our free-thinking community. So there were these controversies and debates and fallouts. And, of course, Richard Dawkins was perhaps at the centre of many of them. Every time he seemed to say anything on Twitter, it would result in a deluge of controversy, even to the point where in 2018, he himself was stripped of his Humanist of the Year award by the American Humanist Association because of his comments around transgender. So all in all, it seemed that once the new atheists had agreed that God didn't exist and that religion was bad for you, they couldn't really agree on anything else. But there was a bigger problem as well. You see, having torn down the notion of God, they offered very little to replace it with. Because science and reason doesn't really buy you meaning, purpose and value. So apart from these internal squabbles, the real reason that I think the new atheism failed as a cultural movement was that it failed to satisfy the deeper questions that people have. And I noticed that as the new atheism began to unravel, that a number of new secular thinkers, these were not people of faith, but secular thinkers were drawing the audience away from the new atheists to their own blogs and podcasts and events. People like the aforementioned Douglas Murray, who, far from dismissing God and the value of religion, were asking, well, can we actually live without something like God or the Christian story? So I want to just kind of do a whistle-stop tour through a few of the notable secular names that have been, I think, opening up the God question rather than closing it down in recent years and in popular culture. And each kind of has their own area of significance. Already referenced this morning, Jordan Peterson, who joined me on my show several years ago. Perhaps the most prominent of these secular thinkers asking different questions. He's a Canadian psychology professor who really rose to fame in 2018 and was somehow able to fill out theatres and auditoriums, even stadiums, with young men hanging on his every word as he dispensed wisdom on how to live a meaningful life. And interestingly, why the Bible has life lessons that can help you to do that. And Peterson was very critical of the new atheists. He said their thinking was very shallow. Now, he wasn't a Christian himself, but he recognises the value of the Christian worldview. He doesn't dismiss it as a fairy tale like the new atheists do. He acknowledges the power of the way this story has transformed the world. And when he came on my own show, he sounded quite like a Christian apologist, frankly, when he was in that discussion with Susan Blackmore, talking about the way that the scriptural claims that humans are made in the image of God is really the fundamental foundation to our idea of individual sovereignty and human dignity. So that's interesting, the Jordan Peterson phenomenon. Another person who I've hosted a number of conversations with is from the UK, Tom Holland, not the Spider-Man actor, in case you're wondering, but a best-selling popular historian whose Rest is History podcast is listened to by millions of people all over the world. Now, Tom Holland has a fascinating story of his own childhood faith sort of sputtering out in his teenage years, but things started to change for him as he embarked on his career writing about the ancient world. And as he explored the world of the Romans and the Greeks, he also realised how alien their way of thinking was to his own, because their world was a world where slavery was simply an unquestionable part of the economy, where certain people could be treated as sexual property, where life was cheap, where it was actually an option to leave newborn children out in the wild if they were unwanted to die, where the slaughter and enslaving of whole populations was a cause for celebration and triumph. And he told me how he realised his own beliefs in human dignity, equality, compassion, freedom, they didn't come from the Greeks or the Romans. They came from the Christian Revolution, begun by someone who died a slave's death in the most humiliating way possible, and yet who claimed to be God. And so through his best-selling book, Dominion, and his interviews and podcasts, he's been reminding the secular world that Christianity is what gave them their moral instincts, not science, not atheism. As he said himself, I began to realise that in almost every way, I am a Christian. Interesting. Already referenced this morning by Andy, Jonathan Haidt. He's someone who's, I think, done an enormous amount helping us to reappreciate the value of ancient wisdom, especially in the Bible. The new atheists really had one approach to the Bible. That was to dismiss it out of hand or make fun of it. But again, the new secular thinkers like Jonathan Haidt, who's a secular Jewish psychologist and the author of best-selling books such as The Righteous Mind, they have a very different approach. Unlike his new atheist contemporaries, Haidt repeatedly talks about the value, the benefits of belonging to religious communities and the well of wisdom contained in their scriptural traditions. When he came on my show, he said, the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament are full of insight. It's not that the ancients were smarter than us, but they wrote a lot down and they had a lot of insights. And what comes down to us is what's been filtered, tested, and found useful. Now, time doesn't allow for me to tell you about all the others in great detail, but I'm just going to whiz through a few more. Louise Perry, fascinating feminist thinker. I mention her in my book, but I only really got to know her a little bit after the book had sort of been finished in its writing. But again, she has written a very influential book called The Case Against the Sexual Revolution. She is a secular feminist, but she came to realise that actually the sexual revolution of the 1960s really favoured men over women. And in the process of looking at that purely through a sort of sociological lens, has come to surprisingly Christian conclusions about marriage and monogamy and relationships. Again, it's fascinating the way that some of these secular thinkers are coming to very Christian-friendly conclusions. Another one, Paul Davies. This is in the area of science. A best-selling physicist like Paul Davies has been pushing against that narrative from the new atheists that science excludes God, because he's been asking awkward questions for most of his career about why the universe seems set up to produce living, conscious creatures who comprehend their place in it. There's something going on, he says, that doesn't make sense in this purely naturalist, materialist worldview. In the area that we've just heard about, mind and consciousness, Ian McGilchrist is a fascinating secular figure, an influential psychiatrist, who's, again, pushing back on the materialist narrative that we're simply our brain, which Sharon spelled out so brilliantly for us. He's pointing out that our search for transcendent meaning is part of human nature, and our brains seem hardwired to not only look for God, but they seem to reflect a divine spark. And there's a great conversation that you can find on the Unbelievable show, online, etc., between Sharon and Ian that I hosted a couple of years ago. So I was seeing these new thinkers drawing an audience that used to turn up for the new atheists, but the answers of these new thinkers didn't necessarily exclude God. Far from it. They've been opening up, in my view, the God questions for their listeners. So I've sensed this new openness among these cultural influences, and all of the people I've mentioned are at different stages in terms of where they personally land on the God question. I think some seem to be holding it off at arm's length, others seem to be on a journey towards faith. But in a way, that's slightly beside the point, because I think they're all, in a funny way, evangelists of different sorts, because they're actually opening the door to other people to take God seriously again. And I've seen a number of people walk through that door because of their influence. And I think the reason that's happening is because people are actually getting very tired today of the atheist materialist account of reality, which denies God and denies the transcendent. Why is that? Well, I think it's because ultimately we're made to worship. Another quote from G.K. Chesterton. He said, when people stop believing in God, they don't believe in nothing, they become capable of believing in anything. And we see that today, actually, in the fact that the new atheism, while it made a lot of headlines, it didn't actually make that many converts. As Andy said, the number of people who actually tick atheist on the box is relatively low. You know, it wasn't creating lots of hard and fast scientific determinist atheists. In a way, I think new atheism was just kind of the cherry on top of a general process of secularization in the West. But the fact is, I don't think people become less religious, even if they get talked out of the Christian story. They just become religious about different things. You see this perhaps most clearly in our contemporary culture, in the numerous ideologies around LGBT, gender and identity that have proliferated. Okay, now I'm not disparaging these things, but it is interesting to see the way in which, for many people, these issues have taken on a quasi-religious significance. To question these identities might be almost, sacrilege. And There are even sort of arguably quite a religious feeling around the activism that's involved. Sacred texts, symbols, rituals. A sacred symbol might be the pride flag today. And they have their heretics too. Think of J.K. Rowling, okay? And it's not just the progressive left. It's important to say, You see it in the sort of rise of forms of white nationalism, right-wing conspiracy theories. There's these kind of religiously tinged stories that people are telling themselves today, both on the left and the right. But it's not a surprise to me that these sort of quasi-religious stories have become so popular in our culture, because at the end of the day, even the atheist psychologists will tell us we're meaning-seeking creatures, we're storytelling creatures, we need a story to live by. But I don't think that's just an accident of biology. I think it's deep within us. And when the Christian story, which for centuries gave people and a whole culture a sense of purpose and identity and meaning, when that goes away, people will find something else to fill that gap, to make sense of their lives. But the problem is that all these new identities and stories and quasi-religious ideologies, they're often actually at odds with each other. And that's why we're in the middle of the so-called culture wars, because we can't agree with each other on the best way to live our life. So that's why Peter Boghossian and all these new atheist leaders, they stopped critiquing religion quite a long time ago, interestingly. We now primarily find them fighting these new battles in the culture wars. They've lined up on one side or the other. And it's because a lot of them think that these new forms of religion are actually a greater threat to science and reason than the Bible ever was. So it's all a bit of a mess. And it's no wonder that, as we've heard, as technology and social media kind of accelerate the pace of these competing ideologies and culture wars, that it's producing a generation of stressed out, confused, depressed and anxious young people. So what do we do? Some psychologists have labelled it the meaning crisis. But I also think of it as an identity crisis, because what people are asking themselves is, who am I? What am I here for? Am I supposed to just invent myself from scratch? Or is there a story I am supposed to live my life by? And my answer is that yes, there is. And though it may seem like we live in a very post-Christian culture, I think the Christian story is actually bubbling away under the surface, and it's ready to resurface at the right time, as it always has in the past. And I think some of the people who are recognizing that are actually these prophets from outside the church, the Jordan Petersons and Tom Hollands and Louise Perrys and Douglas Murrays and so on. Now, those people don't have all the answers, but I think they're asking some of the right questions. But there is a story that does have the answers. It's the big story that makes sense of all those little stories that we tell ourselves. And maybe, just maybe, we are getting to that point where people are ready to hear it again. In the book, I tell the stories not only of these new secular thinkers, but also many adult converts to Christian faith who have found themselves surprised, despite everything, to find that the story of God made sense in their lives and made sense of the bigger picture of things to them. This is a story that says you were made in the image of God. Your life does have meaning and purpose. You're not here by accident. You are valuable. And yes, things have gone terribly wrong. We've all gone terribly wrong. But you're so valuable that the God of the universe crossed the cosmos to become human and to rescue you so that you could be reconciled to him. He died for us so that you could live a new life in the resurrection, because that gives us a hope and a future. And we don't just see ourselves as one more cog in a mindless, materialist universe. We have a unique place in a cosmic drama that's being told through all space and time. That's a story worth believing in, isn't it? It's a story that's so much bigger than these small parochial stories we tend to end up telling ourselves in our culture. And I think the tide is turning. I think we might just be getting to that place where people are running out of energy. Those stories that haven't answered their questions, they're maybe ready to hear the big story again. The story that's actually the undercurrent of so much of what they're thinking and feeling. But the good question for us is, will the church be ready? Because we might be being called not to necessarily answer the questions of the new atheists, but the questions of the meaning seekers, the refugees from this meaning crisis who are going to be washed in on this incoming tide. Can we tell a better story than our culture does of what real life looks like? Can we show people a story that they want to be true and then show them that it really is true. Someone we were talking to in the break referenced this, and I thought, I've got to put this quote in because it just fits perfectly. Blaise Pascal, who a few hundred years ago was a Christian mathematician and philosopher, he said this: make religion attractive, make good men wish it were true, and then show that it is. Very often in my field, apologetics, the defense of the Christian faith, we do a lot of work showing that Christianity is true, but we don't do enough work showing people why they would want it to be true in the first place. And I think that has to come first, actually. And we do that by showing people, just as Andy was describing earlier, that the things they're most passionate about, the things that seem to make a difference in their life, the justice, equality, the movements that they're so invested in, those only really make sense if there's a big story that it fits into. It doesn't make story in the atheist story of reality. It does make sense in the big story of the Christian story. Show them why they would want it to be true. And the good news is, we can then show them it is true. There's really good reasons to believe that someone called Jesus of Nazareth came, lived, died, and rose again. It's my hope and prayer that we will, in our lifetime, see the surprising rebirth of belief in God, and that we'll welcome it and those who are looking for life in all its fullness. Thank you very much. God bless you guys. Thank you.